Thank you very much, first of all, to York University and for the organizers for allowing me this opportunity to discuss my research and also, I guess, offer a broader perspective on the so-called research program on variegated capitalism, which I have come to identify with. And so just for my little presentation, I'll try to cover the following four things. And I don't know to which extent I'll be able to address all of them, but whatever is not covered in my initial presentation, hopefully we can debate subsequently in the more open discussions. So first of all, I'm going to just talk about what is variegated capitalism, what research has been done within the context of comparative capitalism literature, then the application to Chinese capitalism, so efforts to apply that theoretical framework or research program, then some cognate theoretical perspectives, and more broadly on the spatial turn in comparative capitalism research. And then finally, I think, which is where I have more substantive contributions, talks about my own research and my own PhD dissertation and how we can offer some new angles, insights, analytical perspectives on the variegated capitalism approach, as well as Chinese capitalism as a research subject. So yeah, I don't know to which extent people are familiar with the variegated capitalism perspective. So I thought obviously that the ideal thing would be to offer, I guess, a general overview of the context from which it has emerged, the theoretical debates in which it engages. So very briefly put, a variegated capitalism is something that emerged around 2007 or 8, the article initially, as a counter to the so-called varieties of capitalism literature. And many of you might be familiar with the varieties of capitalism literature if you've had any courses in comparative political economy. And here I've just prepared a little brief recap of the VOC approach, and this is by no means exhaustive. So obviously, if people are not familiar with that approach and also want to know the origins of variegated capitalism, of course, it will be meaningful to engage in a more closer reading of the VOC literature. There will be a bibliography towards the very end. So I think there are three pillars of the VOC approach, if you want to summarize it very simply. I think that provides the basis upon which we can then build the variegated capitalism research program. The first thing is I've taken a quote from the Hall and Suski's text, 2001 book, which has been cited multiple thousands of times, and it outlines what it describes as a firm-centered political economy that that regards companies as the crucial actors in a capitalist economy. They are the key agents of adjustment in the face of technological change or international competition whose activities aggregate into overall levels of economic performance. And from this relational perspective of firms as key actors within the capitalist economy, it formulates the following proposition, namely that we can find capitalist formations in national varieties. So national economies, very simply put, converge towards specific ideal typical modes of coordination. And initially, it was based on two modes of coordination. There's the liberal market economies that we know from England and the Anglophone world. And then there's the coordinated market economies, what we see in Germany and in Japan, etc. And then later on, there were some further formulations of other types of ideal types, such as dependent market economies, particularly addressing Eastern European countries that became integrated with global circuits of capital after the 1990s and the end of, the fall of the USSR. So basically, now we established that there are different national varieties of capitalism. And the reason for which we experience this internal homogenization within capitalist formation is because of the following mechanism, which they describe as institutional complementarities. So based on these different types of coordination, economies, they start to converge, institutionally speaking, towards specific types of institutional configurations. So this is a matter of transaction cost economics. So basically, according to those institutional complementarities perspectives, institutional complementarities create the conditions under which we see a convergence towards specific ideal typical organization of market coordination. And that is the basis upon which we experience that we have these liberal market economies, coordinated market economies, dependent market economies, and more recently, state-permeated market economies, which has been applied to emerging markets, emerging countries. So now, having set the ground for the VOC approach, the variegated capitalism approach really attempts to engage or criticize or critique, I think is best choice of word, these key assumptions. The Variegated Capitalism framework, they argue, is methodologically nationalist, first of all, and therefore, because they assume that capitalist economies coalesced around the national scale to form two and later more types of typical varieties, ideal typical varieties, it suffers from some massive deficits. So the critique therefore leads to this idea that there's a tendency towards static analysis and latent institutional functionalism, and by an inability to adequately balance national specificity and path dependency on the one hand with common underlying tendencies in capitalist restructuring on the other. So because of its firm-centric perspective, first of all, we see that the role of the state, among other things, is under-theorized. Second of all, there's also a lack of historical and geographic contingencies, because the assumption is that these indiscriminate different modes of coordination will manifest themselves relatively evenly or in a more uniform way in different countries. And that kind of overlooks the different forms of institutional variations that we experience within countries. So the key assumptions of variegated capitalism, and I guess this is really the whole core part of the debate. I know it took a little bit of build up to reach this point, but that is the three following things. And this is, of course, a very compressed rehash of what variegated capitalism offers. First of all, it depends on a relational and a co-constitutive theorization of different models and formations of capitalism. And I think one of the best example of analysis that captures this relational and co-constitutive perspective is the so-called uneven and combined development. First of all, developed by Trotsky, but later on formulated by a lot of Marxist scholars. And second of all, there's an attempt to engage in multi-scalar perspectives. And this is a direct attempt to depart from the methodologically nationalist assumptions. The idea that national economies are internally homogeneous and that there's lack of institutional variation on the national scale. So a multi-scalar perspective adds that, well, in fact, there are different layers of capital development. There are subnational modes of capitalist development. And because they form co-constitutive relationship, we have to understand those relational factors that allow a system to continuously reproduce itself. And of course, now I'm going to elaborate a little bit about it in terms of the context of the Chinese capitalist economy. Then last of all, there's the assumption of contradictions and friction within the capitalist system. This is also an attempt to depart from the latent functionalism, which tends to perceive things in a more frictionless manner. But instead, if we theorize capitalism as a contradictory system, we see that those contradictions that are structurally inscribed in the capitalist mode of production can also provide the basis to understand the path-dependent developments of capitalism. And in this instance, I will elaborate upon the Chinese example. So in the application of research of variegated capitalism on China, we've seen over the recent decade that there have been a number of applications. This is by no means exhaustive, but these are the things that I initially encountered, which made me interested in variegated capitalism in relationship to Chinese research. I think the most famous of which is by Zhang and Peck. The 2016 article is a great overview, and I recommend everyone to read that if they want to understand how we can theorize it. So the primary contribution has been an emphasis on the co-constitution and co-evolution between regional models of Chinese capitalism. And here by regional, I refer to subnational regional models that foregrounds a multi-scalar perspective, and it also encapsulates a very polymorphic view of capitalism. So you cannot reduce the way in which the Chinese political economy develops into a singular logic. I think most importantly, you can see that emblematically in the development of the coastal inland. The coastal region is known to have been much more developed, whereas the inland regions have remained relatively impoverished for historical reasons. And then there's the second assumption that we have to also understand China's development within the context of its insertion in global production networks and its codependent and reciprocal relations with different forms of processes of development, both in the global level, but also in the regional level and on other scales. So in conclusion, we have to understand the uneven development of Chinese capitalism and the contradictory equilibria that it finds itself in variably throughout its history, even more so in the last 40 to 50 years after the open door policy, emanates from various internal instabilities to the Chinese model. So I think that offers you a very general overview of the variegated capitalism perspective. So just a summary of those three principles. First of all, a relational, processual perspective of capitalist development. Second of all, a multi-scalar perspective. And then lastly, we see that there's an attempt to situate that analysis in a historically and geographically contingent context. And these are three substantive steps away from the varieties of capitalism approach. So now I know not everyone works within the tradition of a variegated capitalism. And you can see that, in fact, many scholars who work broadly in spatial perspectives and geographical perspectives are very much so consistent with the variegated capitalism approach. So people who work in peripheral subjects might also feel sympathetic towards variegated capitalism. And here I list a number of scholars and theorists, which I also draw a lot of inspiration from. And first of all, I think we can situate the research program of variegated capitalism more broadly in historical geographical materialism. And two important scholars of which are Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There's also a 2007 article, I think, by Bob Jessop, Neil Brenner, and Jones, who also talk about theorizing socio-spatial relations, talking about the so-called polymorphic context and conditions of capitalist development and its spatial articulation. So not only should we look at territorial relations, we should also look at scalar relations, about place and networks. Another very important example is Neil Brenner's work from 2004, New State Spaces, where he outlines different assumptions of the state spatial process of capitalism. And he similarly also critiques state-centric assumptions, of which we know methodological nationalism that we already spoke briefly about, but also spatial fetishism and methodological territorialism, which are basically ways of critiquing static conceptions of capitalist spatiality. Then there's also Doreen Massey. I think one of her iconic work, seminal work, is The Spatial Division of Labor she wrote in 1995, which I also draw a lot of inspiration from. I'll elaborate a little bit about its application to some of my research, who also similarly argue for a relational, processual, and a pluralistic approach to understanding capitalist spatiality. And the concept of spatial division of labor, I think she has theorized in a very meaningful manner. Harvey, of course, his talk about tertiary circuit of capital and spatial fixes are also very well-established concepts. And they are all, I think, consistent in terms of assumptions with the variegated capitalism research program. So now, I don't know how much time I've left, especially with the interruptions. I've gotten a little bit lost of track, but I'll just then go into my specific research and some of the interesting things I think of ways in which we can advance the variegated capitalism research program. So my PhD project, and I've entered my third year recently, has sought to understand the emergent changes to China's macrostructural frameworks as a result of its recent transition to a new normal in 2012. After the 2007 crisis, we've seen that China's economy has never really recovered. So for the first time in 40 years, China's economic growth has fallen below 10%. And the new normal is an attempt to rebalance China's institutional and economic foundations. And one of the expressions of this rebalancing is talks such as the Made in China 2025, concepts such as dual circulation, double opening, all of which can be found in the 13th and the 14th five-year plans. And we can tentatively describe this as a phase of emergent post-industrial development, or a shift towards the tertiary sector, as China tries to climb the value-added ladder of global production networks. So whereas in the past it was a primarily manufacturing-based economy, it had the moniker the factory of the world or the workshop of the world, but now it is trying to climb the value-added ladder by performing post-manufacturing service, such as advertisements, marketing, and distribution of goods. And it's also engaging in pre-manufacturing services, such as research and development. And these things are all emblematic of post-industrial development. Now, of course, post-industrial development in China takes a very uneven form. I think that we see currently that the coastal regions are becoming post-industrial, these city regions, whereas the inland is in fact now finally industrializing at a much more rapid pace. And of course, if we adopt a methodologically nationalist perspective to post-industrial development, then you would find it contradictory process. If you see on the one hand, China is still industrializing, but on the other hand, we see specific parts of China becoming post-industrial. But if we adopt a variegated capitalism approach, this development is by no means an issue as such. In fact, it's enlightening because we can understand the relationship between the coastal and inland regions. So in my analysis, I outline 3 dimensions of restructuring. So these are tentative articles. First of all, I argue there's a reconfiguration of coastal inland relations in this post-2012. So the new periodization is followed by new coastal inland relations, where the spatial division of labor and the co-constitution between the developed coast and the underdeveloped inland changes. And that is in part because the spatial relocation of a lot of manufacturing or the secondary sector from inland from the coastal area to the inland. And that has enabled the industrialization of the so-called inland regions, which have been relatively underdeveloped for many years. And then second of all, another way you can talk about this co-constitutive relationship between subnational modes of development is the rural-urban relations. And similarly speaking, if you theorize rural-urban relations from a variegated capitalism perspective, you also have to understand that these are not 2 ontologically discrete spaces. That means that there's not one space that is rural areas and another space that is urban areas. The rural and the urban obviously forms a very close co-constitutive relationship from the way in which it transfers labor through the Foucault system. So social mobility, spatial mobility are all tied together with the institutional geography of China's political economy. And for those reasons, in fact, the underdevelopment of rural areas and the control of mobility in the rural areas to the urban areas has been one precondition for China's historical success to be competitive in its low-wage labor regime and its integration with global production networks. And then lastly, which is, I guess, less original, but is another way in which that is consistent with assumptions of variegated capitalism, is to talk about the internal reconfiguration of post-industrial urban spaces. So look at those spaces within China that are turning post-industrial, those city regions, the Yangtze River Delta, the Pearl River Delta. So these post-industrial cities or city regions or clusters, we see the dominance of the urban as the locus of capitalist development, and that also forms new patterns of exclusion. More specifically, we see that specific socioeconomic classes are becoming marginalized because as the post-industrial city is becoming more developed, it's no longer in need of low-skilled migrant labor. And that's why we see that tier 1 cities to a high degree have been pushing out migrant laborers, and they have lost the so-called right to live, or some people would also describe this as gentrification. And once again, that development and this transfer of low-skilled labor away from the tier 1 cities, the so-called post-industrial developed metropolises, is another expression about China's broader development and how that relocation towards tier 2 and 3 cities is a natural consequence of the co-constitutive relationships between the more developed areas and the less developed areas. And then last of all, just recently I published a paper on the Belt and Road Initiative, where I also try to apply some of the assumptions of variegated capitalism. Variegated capitalism, I used the conceptual innovation by saying that the BRI should be theorized as a variegated agglomeration of multi-scalar state spatial strategies. And here you see I used the concept of Neil Brenner from his New State Spaces by extending his concept of state spatial strategies. And here, similarly speaking, I also argue that we cannot assume that the Belt and Road Initiative is one monolithic construct, one project that is devised by the national government, but you have to understand that it's a multi-scalar process that also involves subnational governments. Each of these 6 corridors, that the constituent corridors of the Belt and Road Initiative had to be theorized in a multi-scalar perspective and as a contested process as well between these differentially situated scalar actors. So these are just brief glimpses into different directions you can take research of the variegated capitalism research program. And I'd love to hear some comments on it, and also now to hear Anil's perspective on post-colonial perspectives.